All right. Good evening, all. Chris, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. In fact, I'm actually quite proud of myself. I remembered to mute the YouTube channel so I don't have to scramble to do that at the last second as it echoes through. So I caught it in advance. So
Good. All right. What's new and interesting this week in your world up there in Ohio?
So I was on leave this past week, which meant in some ways getting caught up on a few work-related things. So I actually spent a surprisingly large amount of time working for a guy who was on leave, and I've been lucky in that everything I say is my opinion only, not the opinion of any bosses, past, present, or future. Employers, et cetera, and serve all the standard caveats. Important to say since I'm going to talk about the day job a little bit. So luckily, my job is about 10 to 20% classified work, but the classified work all involves large groups of people getting together to do classified stuff together.
Okay.
And as a result of that, all that stuff got put on the wayside. So I've been very lucky in that I've been able to be totally and completely gainfully employed from home. In fact, the government's even been so nice as that our normal computers are laptops. So I just grabbed my laptop, brought it home, had to go back to the office a couple of times to get files and stuff like that. But I live like literally 5 minutes away from my office, especially when there's no traffic. So I've been able to be fully gainfully employed from home. And so all these other people are saying, hey, with all your free time, it's like, what free time? I'm actually busier now at home because there isn't that everybody's leaving at the end of the day. I guess I should leave too.
Right. Yeah. No, people don't realize when you work from home, most people work harder.
Yeah.
Or at least more efficiently.
Yeah, and generally it's more efficiently. And there has been times I've really enjoyed the fact it's like, my back is really bothering me, and I know what will fix it. I need to be horizontal for about 20 minutes and just sort of stretch out. And so I can go. I'm 20 feet away from my bed. I can go into my bedroom and just lay out horizontally and take a break. And my solution at the office would be, it's a good time to get up and walk around and go talk to somebody. So I'm not working any less by virtue of the fact that I'm taking a break to go do that. I'm just doing something a little bit different. It does, and I spend a lot of time on VTCs. And so you have to sort of make an extra effort to communicate when you can't just pick up stuff by listening over the cue ball. So there's a lot of it's like, okay, we need to actually make an effort to communicate. And that's actually very much applicable to some of the things I was thinking about. What's the logical follow-up from last week's show? And I was thinking that the logical follow-up is to talk a little bit about how navies do their thing when there's more than one ship involved. Because we talked about carriers last time, right? But a carrier doesn't do anything by itself.
No, of course. It's always got a fleet, a little battle group being towed along with it.
The only time you ever see an aircraft carrier doing stuff by itself there's two occasions. It's doing some sort of workup, like it just came out of the yard and they need to go out and just sort of make sure everything works. So they go, they come out of the San Diego and they go tooling around for a while and see if everything's working. Or the other thing that carriers will do is sometimes they need a ready deck to train the air wing. And so like you've got something called the RAG, the Ready Air Group, which is basically all the guys that had a shore assignment who are going back out to sea. All the pilots that had a shore assignment need to go back out to sea. And the thing about all those landing on aircraft carrier type skills, they're all highly perishable.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And it's not that, okay, there's the old saying, you never forget how to ride a bike, that sort of stuff. Once you get back on, it'll come right back to you.
Right.
And yeah, that's true to a certain degree, but it's really one of those things that, you got to be an A-list performer if you're landing on an aircraft carrier, right?
Yeah.
And so you gotta sort of knock the rust off a little bit. And when you're out at sea on an aircraft carrier, now, I was always an anti-submarine guy. I was never an airplane guy. I only cared about airplanes to the degree that they could find submarines.
Okay.
I mean, airplanes are really, really cool, and all that air wing stuff is really, really cool. But I was there to find submarines, so I'm not as well versed on the airplane carrier qual side of it as I could be, despite the fact that I spent 45 days on aircraft carriers. But one of the things is that you have to be making landings pretty constantly. Like I think for night quals, you have to make a landing like every 3 days, or you lose your night qual and you have to get recertified.
Damn.
Now, getting recertified just means you have to do it X number of times proficiently. If you've been away a long time, there might be some classroom stuff to remind you what the procedures are, et cetera, because it's all about making sure that everybody does the same thing at the same time. Everybody's operating in a safe and effective manner. And that includes things like everybody's operating in a way that's what's expected, right? You don't want people ad-libbing stuff like this, right? Because it's really complicated. It's really dangerous. You can get people killed that way. So there's always this issue with you have to stay carrier qualified, and they certify everything. Like when a carrier is going through its workup process, when a carrier strike group is going through the workup process, they're constantly getting evaluated and certified to do various things. And it's like, you get certified to do independent deep water operations, right? You get certified to take the ship to sea. You have to get certified to do that. And on the one hand, that sounds like, oh, there's a lot of paperwork. But the other thing is that it's 5,000 people. It costs $1 million+ a day to run it. You've got all these different airplanes. It's a capital investment of like $10 billion. Yeah, there's a little paperwork. Make it all work. And it's all designed to make sure that it stays safe, because this is something where you could easily, you lose the bubble for 30 seconds and you could end up with 100 people dead easily. Oh. It's happened, right? And so you get certified to do all this stuff, and the air wing gets certified to do all this stuff. And you start off with independent ship stuff, right? So all the different ships get certified to sort of like do their thing. Actually, let me go back a little bit. You've been to sea. Your carrier strike group's been to sea. You've been deployed to the Western Pacific. You are aces. You are great. You are the tip of the spear. You are perfect. And before, say, 2003, what would happen is you came back and you pulled into port, and everybody went on leave, and you became combat ineffective like that. And it's because you just pulled into port, everybody goes on leave. So for a while there, you're just manning minimal watches. Everybody detaches to go get transferred to go off to school or to go to another ship or go to a shore billet or whatever. You get a whole bunch of new people in. You go into the yard for a while, so you're not practicing going to sea, and the airplanes have all left, so you're not practicing with having airplanes around, et cetera, et cetera. And you got a whole bunch of new people that need to be trained up, and the old people are at the point where they need refresher stuff. So you become combat ineffective really fast. After 9/11, they actually changed that, because one of the things that people I don't think appreciate is, in order to surge the carriers to conduct the operations in Afghanistan, they screwed up the deployment ratio for like 5 years. They totally and completely, they threw the schedule out the window. On September 10th, you could have looked at the schedule, and you could have known where the USS Nimitz was going to be in 2007. On September 10th, 2001, you would know that far out where they were going to be, probably. Now, things always change, and you start off with the plan and things get changed. But the idea is that they plan it out that much because they have to meet certain commitments. And some of those commitments are designed according to what our strategy is. Our commitment is, our plan is we want to have a certain presence in this location. But there's also treaty commitments that go along with all this stuff. So like we have treaties that will say, with Yakistan, we promise that we will have in order for access to their air base, we promise we will provide such and such capability nearby to do like ballistic missile defense or this or that or the other thing. And, sometimes the Navy gets to do that, and sometimes the Air Force gets to do that. So occasionally you end up with things where it's like, we're going to have the Air Force has an issue. They can't deploy that squadron because their airplanes got grounded because there was some sort of safety thing. So the Navy aircraft carrier has to stay deployed for another month to cover the gap caused by when the Air Force grounded their airplanes. You got shit like this that happens all the time, and they're constantly juggling this stuff around. So after 9/11, they changed the op tempo such that when a carrier comes back, they try to hold it in a ready position. They don't immediately shift everybody around, et cetera. They try to keep them surge capable for a month or two to make it easier in case the balloon goes up. But you still have this thing called the bathtub curve, where you start out, you got your act together, you're just ready to go, you're ready to go fight the war. You come back, you slide down to the bottom of the bathtub curve, ships go into the shipyard, they get all their work done, you get new crews, you train them up, and then you slowly start creeping up the other side of the bathtub curve until you get to the point where you're ready to deploy. And that's the part that I lived in generally, because I usually went on board the carrier when they were doing something called the Joint Task Force exercise, which is their final exam before they are certified excellent, ready to deploy. Right? So a bunch of officers come on board, led by an admiral, with a captain as the chief of staff, and a bunch of commanders and lieutenant commanders. And in back when I was doing it, some guys from the Center for Naval Analysis who would do the reconstruction and would help the senior officer observer team, the SOOT, make the determination as to whether they're ready to deploy or not. Dirty little secret, they're always ready to deploy, because the political ramifications of saying a battle group or a carrier strike group isn't ready to deploy was just too serious to contemplate. So that's how that all works. And so, but there's this process whereby they have to get recertified to do all this stuff. And remember, this is all about the other instance in which an aircraft carrier goes to sea by itself. So as they bring pilots back in and they get them all ready to go deploy, they're going to go off to a squadron and they're going to go to sea again, and it's been a while, and they need to sort of like get the rust knocked off of them. They go to the Ready Air Group. The Ready Air Group or Ready Squadron. I can't remember what it's called. It's been a while, and it wasn't my Jeopardy category anyway. And then they'll send an aircraft carrier out for a day, just so that people can come and do touch and goes, and they can land on the carrier, and then they can get shot off the front end, and they just go out and they do all that stuff. For a long time, we had an aircraft carrier that was specifically, that's all it did. I want to say it was the USS Lexington. It was a World War II era carrier. It was a training carrier, and they flew trainers off of it, relatively small airplanes, but they were carrier capable. And it had a wooden flight deck. It was that old. Wow. And that carrier was in the fleet until like 1985-ish, 86, something like that. I remember reading about it when I was in high school. And so any other time a carrier goes to sea, it's generally got escorts with it. And those escorts are there to defend the carrier, because the carrier is really optimized to do airplane stuff. And
right.
As a result of that, it's sub-optimized to do everything else.
Right.
And the other thing is that it's not only designed to be optimized for that, when it's doing its thing, it really can't be distracted.
Right.
Any more than it can be, right? Because they're always like looking to get into the wind, etc. If you go back to the days of battleships, you had escorts. And the purpose of the escorts was to sort of spread out the defense and spread out the offense to sort of keep the other guys busy. And it wasn't so much in those days that the battleships couldn't defend themselves against like torpedo boats and stuff like that. It's that you didn't want them to have to waste their time doing it. Right. So this is the equivalent of the lawyer making $500,000 a year or $1 million a year is going to hire a paralegal because it's way too expensive for him to be doing that research. Right. He can do it. He can do it.
That's not the best use of his time.
Not the best use of his time. So For battleships, it wasn't the best use of their time to be defending against torpedo boats or doing stuff like that. So you bring some other guys along to do it. And that's a much different thing than what you saw in the Age of Sail. In the Age of Sail,
True. Right.
frigates were auxiliaries. They had an entirely different mission, but they weren't there to fight in the line of battle. We've talked about this before, right? So when an aircraft carrier goes to sea, it's got these escorts that are there to defend it, to do strike missions with their onboard missiles, to do boarding operations, because pulling an aircraft carrier up next to a tanker to see if all the paperwork's in order, yeah, that doesn't work. Although they might send guys with a helicopter. You can send one of these guys off down a threat axis. So generally, if you know where the threat's coming, you take one of your Aegis shooters and you send him off in that direction so he can sort of be over there paying attention to because we think that's where the bad guys are coming from, if they're coming. And then you've got like one that's playing shotgun close to the carrier, and then you've probably got one or two other guys, and you've got them spread out so they've got as much air cover as they can. And also what you're trying to do is you want to have assets available to deal with surface or subsurface threats.
So if you can back up for a second, for the uninitiated, tell us a carrier battle group. What kind of ships are there? You got your carrier, and what else? What other kind of ships do you have?
So that's an even better question than you think it is, because the answer is it's changed over time, and B, the nomenclature's actually changed. When I first started, we were dealing with carrier battle groups, which had approximately, more or less, an aircraft carrier, which is a high value unit, an HVU, which means, so it's the basket in which the eggs are put, and you're defending the eggs, right? So you've got a high value unit in the carrier, you've got a high value unit in the oiler, and then you've got, at that time, you generally probably had 2 Ticonderoga class cruisers, which are Aegis capable warships, 2 Arleigh Burke class destroyers, or maybe an Arleigh Burke and a Spruance, which are the Arleigh Burkes are Aegis destroyers, so they can do air warfare, but they're smaller and they've got fewer missiles. Spruances are optimized for subsurface warfare. And then you generally had a frigate along. And the frigates were really sort of optimized for subsurface warfare. They could defend themselves from air threats, at least initially. They eventually took that missile off because they didn't want to do maintenance on it anymore, because they knew they were getting ready to frigate. So they got rid of the missile first, so they just didn't have to do the maintenance on it. And so you end up with a total of about 6 or 7 ships, of which 2 were high value units.
Okay.
It used to be, if you dialed back 15, 20 years, so you go back to like the 80s, it was more like 10 or 11 ships. The ships were less capable. So as the Navy got smaller, the ships also got more capable. And you ended up with less ships in a carrier battle group. About the time, I think the first time I went to sea, maybe the first 2 times I went to sea on aircraft carriers, they had carrier battle groups. Then they went to this idea of a carrier strike group. And the reason why they did that is because the way it usually worked is you had a carrier battle group, and then you had the amphibious ready group. And the ARG, so it's a bunch of amphibs, LHDs, LHAs, ships like that, carrying Marines, carrying helicopters, carrying landing craft. But they were kind of like, they would tag along with the battle group, hopefully, but they didn't really have the escorts that they kind of needed. And so the idea was we wanted to, A, give them escorts, and B, turn them into offensive threats in and of themselves without, other than just like they might do an amphibious landing, right? So we need to get some missile shooters in there. So we weren't getting any more ships. So we had to divide the ships by, the denominator got bigger, or the denominator got bigger. So we were dividing them into smaller packages. So they created this concept called the carrier strike group, as opposed to a carrier battle group. So they could also then create these expeditionary strike groups, which was the ARG plus these escorts. Now, in practice, they say, expeditionary strike group, et cetera, And then once they got in theater, they'd send the ARG part of the ESG off in one direction, and they'd take all the escorts and send them off on individual missions in someplace else. So as a general rule, they didn't end up actually staying deployed that way. That frequently happens. You'll sometimes hear people use the phrase chop, as in like I chopped into theater. That's change of operational command. So it's like when you cross the line in the ocean and you no longer are owned by this guy, you're now reporting to this other guy. Good. You've chopped. So frequently, right when they chop, it's like, here are your orders, and everybody goes off in their own separate directions.
So tell me how.
Oh, and there's also usually, in theory, there was 2 submarines back in the old day and 1 submarine in the new day. That's a really great theory. And if anybody's ever actually seen that happen, I've never heard about it, because submarines are low density, high demand assets, and they always get sent off someplace else. Almost.
So how did it work? So tell me, back up a second and say, how did it work in World War II? Because World War II was really the first war where we really had carrier battle groups. How was a battle group configured in World War II?
So I don't have as good an understanding of that as because I've never really sort of sat down and looked at it from that perspective. I mean, I've read a lot of World War II history,
right?
But usually they don't go through and say this is what the doctrine is and this is how they operate and stuff like that. But you had destroyers, lots of destroyers, because you'd frequently, if you were doing battle line tactics, you'd send the destroyers off by themselves to conduct attacks. I know that in the interwar period, you had destroyer squadrons, you had cruiser squadrons. U.S. doctrine in the interwar period said the destroyers will go off and do torpedo attacks, especially at night, and we would keep the cruisers, like the light cruisers, with the as part of the escort force to protect against enemy destroyers. And that's one of the reasons why you do that is now you can do rudimentary friend or foe identification by the type of ship. Oh, it's a light cruiser coming out of the gloom, and we know our light cruisers are over here, so it must be a bad guy, right?
Gotcha.
Now that's very crude, but that's a good start. So, and then the battle line. I mean, originally in World War II era, the idea is that you have the battle line operate as a unit, and this is one of the things we don't really see in science fiction, is this idea of everybody's maneuvering together. Like in Star Trek, battles in Star Trek look more like air fights than they do like ship fights. And even then, they're really undisciplined air fights in that you have people, you don't like have wingmen and stuff like that, right? Right. They just sort of like everybody flies all over the place doing their thing. Whereas in reality, a large part of what you end up doing and a lot of your effort in battle is making sure that that isn't what you end up happening, right? You want everybody to be coordinated because you're trying to optimize a result. And so you're trying to optimize your ability to put firepower on somebody else, and you're trying to sub-optimize their ability to do it to you, right? And that right there is sort of the definition of naval tactics, right? That is what you're trying to do. And what that means is where all the that's where the proof is in the pudding. That's where all the money is to be made. And so back in World War II, I mean, one of the reasons why hybrid battleship carrier combinations, which were kind of popular as an idea for a while, and every now and then people would, like even in the 80s, they talked about it, why those really don't work, is that the battleship kind of wants to get close to the enemy and is really sort of concerned about doing maneuvering designed to allow it to put its gun on the enemies. The aircraft carrier wants to stay away from those guns because it's big, vulnerable, and full of 100,000 gallons worth of aviation fuel. It doesn't want to be anywhere near those guns. And it's maneuvering in order to go into the wind so that it can conduct flight operations. Doesn't have time to do that. And that doesn't even include things like having a big gun go off, detonate, firing near airplanes is not good. Pressure wave and all the rest of it, yeah, not good.
I bet.
You don't want to be out on the deck of a battleship when it fires. I heard a story about back in the 80s. What you end up, you'll see this especially on old ships that have armor, but you see this on others on modern ships too, where you've got a door that's either designed as an armored bulkhead or it's designed to be watertight. And it's got like a complicated locking mechanism and stuff like that. And then inside of that, you've got a door that just has a regular door handle on it and a regular door frame. And the idea is that one of those is a protection boundary. The other one is designed to prevent the air conditioning from getting out, right? Or it's an access control door, right? Its purpose is just so that the air conditioning doesn't get out, or the people don't get out, or it's like it's a classified space, you're not allowed in it. It's about people control and atmospheric control. It's not about protection per se. And you'll have one of those inside the other. So you've got this big armored door that you open up, and then you've got just a regular door. Well, there was one incident in the 1980s where one of the battleships was doing a gunnery exercise, and they forgot to close the armored door. And when the guns fired, it blew the other door off the frame, and it went across the space, taking out all the stuff hanging from the ceiling, like all the radio telephones that they had put in.
Oh my God.
Boom, boom, and slammed against the far wall. Yeah. Yeah, that was a mistake I'm sure they didn't make a second time.
Wow.
I heard another story about an officer who'd gotten caught outside when they fired, and like he couldn't hear for like 5 hours.
Oh God, I can imagine. Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean yeah. So it's having an explosion go off next to you, and just it's a controlled explosion. You're aiming the explosion in one direction, but it's literally an explosion going off next to you. So those don't mix with airplanes. That stuff doesn't mix with airplanes. So you don't want any of that stuff anywhere near each other. So if you're trying to optimize on two different variables, you're really sub-optimizing on two different variables. These hybrid things look great and they're cool, etc. But if there's a reason why you need to dedicate to one, then you need to dedicate to one. And that goes back to what I was saying last week about, the flight deck dominating everything, right? So it's perhaps different if what you can do is just sort of push them out of launch bay and they can go fly off and do their thing. Maybe there's a really interesting operations research problem in there to sort of figure out what the optimal answer is. It may be that you come up with the idea that a space-going aircraft carrier is still the right answer, but you will get to that conclusion by a different way than you get to it in a surface Navy. In a surface Navy, you get there because it's the physics of water and air. And once you sort of do that, you have to do it that way. And once you have to do it that way, go all in. No half measures. Do it all the way. So getting all those ships together and sending them all out to sea, and even creating a situation where they don't accidentally run into each other is hard. Got to really practice that stuff. And you would think, like, how can ships run into each other? You just steer out of the way. Well, driving a ship isn't like driving a car. It really isn't. There was a collision that happened between the USS Washington and the USS Indiana, I think, in the Pacific in World War II, like 1944-ish, I think. The Washington sounded its collision alarm like a full 60 seconds before the collision happened.
Wow.
They saw a situation where a collision might happen. They had a minute to try to make it not happen, and they were unable to make it not happen.
Wow. Now, what kind of ships were these?
2 battleships.
Two battleships.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
Yeah. And USS Washington ended up crunching her bow pretty badly, and they had to put a temporary bow on her, and they sent her back to the West Coast to have a new bow fitted, if I remember correctly. Washington was a very interesting ship. There's a nice little bio on the Washington. Washington was involved in a very famous battle with the Kirishima.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I always call it Washington versus Kirishima versus South Dakota, because that's how they ended up firing on. And I used to think for a long time, I thought, like, how could the crew of South Dakota was a bunch of putzes, right? You know, they like set up their wiring wrong, and there's a whole bunch of things they did wrong. It was only within the last 5 years that I discovered something that's really, really important, and that was their shakedown cruise.
Right. I remember. I
think I said that once before.
6 months ago, because just because I play World of Warships, the game, it's people to talk about what ships they want, and everyone's yelling for, we want the Washington, we want the Washington. So that story came up, and I think we read about it.
Yeah, right. That sounds right. BB-58, I think is, yeah. I think that's right. All right. Hold on a second. There's only 3 VTCs in the last 14 weeks, so. But so I'm a lot more forgiving of the South Dakota, because it was like, I mean, the Navy had just taken that ship. I mean, it was they still, normally there's this formal workup procedure where the Navy takes delivery officially and they put a crew on board, and they go and they basically spend a month at sea just drilling and learning how their ship works and getting proficient at stuff, etc. Instead, these guys were told, go defend Guadalcanal. And so, okay, in retrospect, I think they did a really good job, considering the fact that they literally got thrown right into the meat grinder with little or no preparation. So here's to the crew of South Dakota. They did as good a job as they could in that situation. Crew of Washington was fantastic. They hit on their first salvo.
Right.
And they, I think I told the story in the very first one, but I'll tell it again. They got a chance. I got a chance to listen to one of their gunnery people give a talk back when I was in grad school. So this was like 1988. And he talked about how the gunnery boss on Washington thought that our gunnery doctrine was all jacked up. And so they did their own thing. They threw out the book and did their own thing. And it worked really well. And it worked so well that when they got back to Pearl Harbor, they were run ragged, going to all the other battleships in the fleet and giving them the briefing on, here's how our process worked. And as far as I understand it, it became the way of doing things from that moment forward. And that's the other thing that people don't have a full appreciation of. There were all these tactical publications that came out. Anytime you were involved in a battle, anytime you did an airstrike, anytime you did anything, when you got back, you were debriefed quite extensively, and all that information got collated, and there was constant tactical publications coming out, tactical bulletins saying, here's what works, here's what doesn't, here's what we're seeing the bad guys doing, here's, we've got indications they've got a new airplane, et cetera, just collecting all that information from the war fighters and distilling it down and figuring out what it means, and then feeding it back to everybody so that everybody understands what it is. And that's a huge effort to make that happen. And they did it day in, day out throughout the entire war. It's really hard. So they were constantly evolving tactics and stuff over the war. Stuff worked, stuff didn't work. And that's just how they did it. And it's not, not just the Navy. The Army and the Air Force did the exact, the Army Air Corps, and the Marines all did the exact same thing. So back in the old days, you had carrier battle groups. They had about 11 ships. Carrier strike groups had about 5 or so. And then you had these expeditionary strike groups that do their things. But the carrier strike groups, they might lose 1 or 2 ships to go off and do, like, we need somebody to go do maritime intercept operations because we're in the Gulf and we're looking for illegal Iranian oil or this or that or the other thing, or counter piracy or whatever. So they might go off and they do stuff like that. The rest of the time, they're all working together, trying not to run into each other, which can be hard. And optimizing, it's a very big, very complex situation. They're trying to optimize all that stuff. And you've got different people working different parts of the problem. So it's not like there's one radio channel where all these people are talking to each other. There's a dozen radio channels where various people are talking to each other. So on the bridges of the ship, you've got bridge to bridge, which is a short range comm. And it's, that's the way that they query merchant ships, but it's also, they'll talk to each other sometimes and pass information that way. And that's mostly about safety of navigation. There's lots of, this is warship 65 off your port beam. What are your intentions? And that's a message that basically says, we're getting close to each other and I would like to not run into you. So can you give me an idea of what you're planning to do so that I can do what I need to do to not run into you, right? And those sorts of communications aren't Navy specific. People do that all the time. Then you've got like the air warfare people. So all the people responsible in that carrier strike group for air warfare, they've got their own tactical network and they're all talking about air warfare stuff together. All the people that are doing surface have their own tactical net and they're doing surface. All the subsurface people have a tactical net. The strike people have a tactical net. All these tactical networks have names because they're standard networks. It's standard procedure. Like the one I used to listen to was SCC CNR, Sea Combat Commander Contact and Reporting. I always had SCC CNR going on. Sometimes there was a strike network that usually we ended up talking to the submarine on the strike network, because the strike network, if they're doing a Tomahawk strike, they're using it. The rest of the time, it's empty. Now, somebody owns it, right? So there's the person who owns it, and you ask their permission. So like if you want to borrow somebody else's network to have a conversation on it, you say, may I have the net? You don't interrupt somebody else's conversation. You also don't leave conversations hanging any longer than you need to, right? So it's like if 2 different ships are having a conversation back and forth about something, one of them says, wait one, basically I need to go ask somebody and then I'll come back on board. Everybody else waits. And then once they do an out, you don't say over and out, you say over or you say out, you don't say both. But once they do out, then somebody might come on and say, this is USS such and such, may I have the net? Yes, you may. They have their conversation with whoever they need to talk to, and at the end, after they're done, they say, I relinquish the net. So I'm handing it back to you. Very set level of procedures to do all this stuff. Lots of different people talking to each other. And then during the time I was going to sea, chat was beginning to be a thing. And so people were talking to each other in chat. And so I'm sure a lot of the conversation I just talked about, remember my information is 15 years old. I've only spotty information in the last 15 years, and most of that is 10 years old because I haven't actually worked for the Navy in over 10 years. And so yeah, I'm sure a lot of that stuff is now done in some sort of chat function because it was getting that way. Like a lot of the communication with the submarine was being done in chat. And they had separate little chat rooms, separate little chat channels that replicated that stuff. You never see anything that even remotely looks like this in visual media science fiction. No, the closest you get is Battlestar Galactica, where sometimes you can tell that there are other conversations taking place.
Right.
And I love it whenever Adama got on and said, this is Galactica actual, because that's exactly what they would say. If the actual captain of the ship gets on, or the actual admiral gets on, or the actual sea combat commander gets on, they will use the term actual to say, yeah, you're not talking to a lieutenant, or you're not talking to a chief, or even a petty officer. a petty officer, second class. You are actually talking to the man. And they don't talk on the net very much. Oh, and while those other conversations are going on, the admiral and his staff, i.e. his staff, are listening to all those conversations. They've got people dedicated to each of those networks, and they'll jump on if they need to. But as a general rule, you don't hear them. They practice command by negation. The admiral promulgates his intent and tells his people, go forth and do good work. Right. And as long as they're doing good work, the admiral and his staff don't say anything on the radio. It's very rare to hear them on the radio. So making all those ships work together, there's this huge communication issue. They're also sharing data through various data networks. The Aegis weapon system has its own network, so it gives you special symbology that will tell you what the difference between an airplane and a non-airplane, a surface ship and a submarine, etc., and other different things. It gives you an indication about course and speed. The symbology is actually little triangles and circles and squares and stuff like that, and the shape of it it will tell you whether it's a known friendly or an unknown or a known hostile. And that information is shared throughout a larger network. But that's all, and we talked about this a little bit before, that's all track quality data generally. So track quality data, it's like the equivalent of, I can say, hey, Alec, look over there, right? And you look over there and you see the thing that I'm sort of pointing out to you, like, see that bird over there, and you look over there, right? But that's a way different situation than me, like, trying to give you directions on where to point a gun to shoot the bird, right?
Right.
Yeah, way different situation. So you're passing track quality data back and forth, but we've gotten to the point now where we're actually passing targeting quality data, and it's taking into account all the precision, all the positioning information, etc. And GPS is one of those things that makes things like that happen. There's this thing called PNT, which either means position, navigation, and timing, or precision navigation and timing. I am one of the people that seems to be on the losing end of the argument. I think it makes more sense to say precision, navigation, and timing, because position and navigation are really kind of redundant terms.
What do you mean?
And the thing that makes it special is the precision part of it. And so...
Sorry. Dog's eating something not supposed to be eating.
I gathered as much. And so that allows them to sort of do targeting stuff, but they're passing lots of information back and forth. And then you've even got some information that's going back to higher headquarters and stuff like that. They can sort of tag in and take a look at some of that stuff. And there's a couple of different things going on with that. And you've got different people putting information into it. So this is the sort of stuff that in a science fiction universe I would expect to really kind of be handled automatically, right? You kind of expect that stuff to be going back and forth. And in Star Trek, you get little hints that it is every now and then. But you still seem to have way more instances of people in general just sort of talking on the radio than I would think. And it sort of seems to me that
it's all for dramatic effect.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense, and because listen, a Galaxy class starship has a computer core that's so massive, because one of the things it does is break down a person into their constituent molecules, beam them across a distance, and reassemble them, which takes so much freaking computer power. So you got to tell me I got to wait till John Luke says, and fire now in order to fire my phasers. I mean, that's all done. And that decision is done before,
I mean, the computer core is the size of my apartment building.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's the size of my apartment building. It's that big, probably, when you add it all up. Yeah. So, yeah, and I mean, it is what it is. I understand why they do it that way, etc. And in written science fiction, you see some written science fiction seems to have a better handle on some of the implications of the stuff that they're talking about, and that's great. And I don't think this makes any of it wrong. It's just like, I mean, I'm a naval analyst at heart, so when I see a navy, I analyze it, and sometimes those navies don't actually exist, right? But that doesn't stop me from analyzing them. And it doesn't stop me from sort of like seeing areas where you can make stuff better. I've got a long list of things I need to go back and rewatch. In part because people are reminding me, it's like, oh no, we did see a situation where Vipers used. I think we did see a situation where a Viper used a nuke. It's like, okay, that's good. Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that, etc. So I need to go back and watch Battlestar Galactica, the new one. I want to go and watch Space Above and Beyond, which I haven't seen since I saw it on broadcast, 25 years ago. God, has it really been 25 years? Yeah, it had to be, because I was living in the rental townhouse, and I lived in there from 94 to 96. I want to go back and rewatch Andromeda, which was really very interesting for the first few seasons before Kevin Sorbo took over the show. They had a retired naval officer on staff to sort of make all that stuff work. And they went farther than anybody else I've seen in their backstory in sort of thinking about this like they were designing an actual Navy. I was just looking at it. Let me see if I've got it. There are 15 canonical mission areas that the Argosy, which I think is what they called their space navy, that the Argosy would be called upon to participate in. And they all sound like the sort of thing that a U.S. Navy ship might, the U.S. Navy might list as their mission areas. Like there's anti-starship warfare, destroy, disable, or disrupt hostile assets and operations, battle group defense operations, conduct defensive action for the battle group in the theater of operations, command, control, and communications, provide operational command and control capabilities for battle group assets. And all the different ships, in the background information they had these mission areas, and they gave a numerical value for the ship's ability to perform them. And so some ships were capable of doing it, and some ships, had high scores and things, and others had lower scores. And they structured their battle groups around either a heavy cruiser or a planetary assault ship, plus some number of escorts. Now, that's an interesting structure, because that's something that sounds a lot like that carrier strike group that I talked about earlier. I mean, that's kind of how we do aircraft carrier stuff, but that's most definitely not how we organized for battle line tactics back in the days of battleships. Back in those days, you'd have a battleship squadron, and you'd have like a light cruiser squadron, and you'd have a destroyer squadron, and multiple. You'd have like a squadron, I think, was 8 ships, and you'd have 2 divisions in a squadron, if I remember correctly, 2 4-ship divisions. And so your tactical unit was about 4 ships, right? You'd never, if you had one squadron, and you might split into 2 4s for maneuvering, because like when you're cruising, you don't know where the threat's going to come up. So they had a cruising formation, and then they had a battle line formation. So, and the U.S. Navy had this down to a science. Basically, they had a set of standard operating procedures. So when they made contact with the enemy, all the admiral had to send was a execute order and a course. And once he did that, everybody else knew what to do. So there was none of this, you guys go up front, you guys do this. It was like, here's where it is. Everybody knew what the maneuver they needed to do to get in line and where they were supposed to be, and the destroyers like knew when they were to conduct an attack if they were in a position to do it, et cetera, et cetera. The entire idea was to have a set of what are known as pre-planned procedures, or pre-planned responses. I'm sorry, PPRs, so that you can turn them loose, and you don't have to think that through. That's your tactics are all set up. You just say, here's what I want you to do, execute, and you go do it. David Weber does a great job of that in his books. And you see, every now and then you'll see a glimmer of that in Star Trek, a glimmer of that in some other things. Not as many glimmers as I would like. Andy Presby was telling me that there was something where the Romulans had, planetary extermination pattern 9.
Oh yeah, that in Picard.
Cardassians. It was Cardassians. Which he said, that means they've got 9 of these, and I said, no, it means they've got at least 9 of them.
Right. Yeah.
Who knows how high that number goes?
Yeah, that was in Picard. The Romulans had that. She was like, planetary extermination pattern 5 or whatever it was.
Oh yeah. It was in Picard. I watched Picard, and it had some really, really interesting things. I kind of felt like it was less than the sum of its parts. Unfortunately.
I haven't read Claude's. Claude, is that it? Claude Berube?
Claude Berube?
Yeah, who wrote an article advocating for the single ship design that we saw in Picard.
I need to go back and reread that. I read it very quickly, and I've got the tab open. But I think I was just getting ready to read that when Apple forced an update and my computer started rebooting. It was kind of annoying because I thought I had all that stuff turned off. They must have thought it was really important that I get that update. And luckily everything worked, but it did sort of screw up about 4 hours of that day as it just kept rebooting.
We should actually both read that and then discuss it next week. That would be a good topic for discussion.
I think that would be. Claude is a very sharp guy. Claude is the guy who organizes NavyCon, so they've done 2 of them so far, and they're going to do a 3rd one. That one's going to be organized by a guy at, I think, Texas A&M, if I remember correctly. And NavyCon is wonderful. It's available on YouTube for anybody who wants to go look at it. As I said in my NavyCon talk this year, I had realized at some point in the spin up to it that what I do is really kind of something different than what they do. They kind of look at science fiction as a way to sort of illustrate the real world. I kind of look at the real world as a way to illustrate science fiction.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so in some ways I'm the exact opposite of what they're trying to do in that regard. But the NavyCon stuff is really pretty fun. Well,
I will definitely make sure I read his article. So we can have a chat about it.
Yeah, and as a very quick approximation, having seen it, and this is something that we should talk about at some point. In fact, I had a little bit of a conversation with Pat about this week. It's always interesting looking at the various assumptions that go in behind stuff, right? And so when you're talking about the current U.S. Navy, you can really make an argument in favor that you don't want lots of different hull forms, right? You don't want lots of different ship types, right? Because then you can standardize your training, you standardize your parts, you make the logistics part of it a lot easier.
Right.
Well, does that apply in, say, with Starfleet? Because their parts, my guess is that you don't get parts for the Enterprise by going back to the depot to get a part sent out to you. You get a part for the Enterprise by either manufacturing it yourself, because
right.
You got replicators, right?
You got replicators, exactly.
So you replicate it yourself, Maybe it's something that you can't really replicate, in which case you go to some place that's got the big replicator and they replicate it for you, or they machine it or do whatever they need, whatever machining means in this universe. They produce it for you basically on site from their computer file. So from a logistics standpoint, it really doesn't simplify your situation. And everybody in Starfleet is trained to the nines. I mean, they're incredibly fantastic.
And also, one of the things they you talk about is everything is fully customizable.
Yeah.
Right. So there's Pat jumping in for the last 3 minutes, looking like he's knocking off a bank.
Yeah. Pat must still be at the facility. My guess is Pat is walking out to his car even as we speak.
You are correct, sir.
So Pat just got off of work because Pat is an airline pilot who is an instructor pilot at a simulator. And so simulators run 24/7 or as close to it as they can get, consistent with keeping the simulator maintained. And so Pat gets to work nights every now and then.
I do. Other times, very, very early in the morning.
I did that explanation because I'm specifically thinking that I can say it clearer than Pat can while wearing a mask.
Well, just before Pat jumped, I was saying, everything in a starship. I don't think that it's important that all these starships be the same because they're all so customizable.
Yeah,
it's just one of the things I learned was how when the F-18 came online, the pilots loved it so much because you could make an F-18 fly like an F-14 if you wanted, or an A-4 if you want. You could customize it so that it had the feel of flying different planes.
Yeah, and the F-18, one of my students when I was in Newport, an F-18 pilot, was talking about how that with the fly-by-wire system and the computers associated with it, that airplane is so good at staying in the air that it will stay in the air perfectly smooth right up until the point where it stalls and falls out of the sky. Because he said you can get distracted in the cockpit. You can have your head down doing something, and then all of a sudden you look out at the wings, and the wingtips are flittering like this because the airplane is doing everything in power because you have given it enough gas and it's about to stall, and it's doing everything in its power to prevent it from stalling. And it's like, oh shit, yeah, I need to give it some more throttle. And he said every F-18 pilot's had that happen at one time or another.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, Pat. We appreciate you stopping in.
To the end.
Yeah, we're at the end.
Yeah, not a problem. Hey, the only thing I will say is part of that making one plane fly like another was part of the problem of the 737 MAX.
Yes.
Oh, really?
That's a case of where they didn't. I don't know all the details. I'm certainly not an engineer, but that's a case of where maybe they didn't quite pull it off.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff on YouTube about how it was a combination of a bunch of factors. One of them was, in order to make that work, they actually there was a subsystem on it that would take control of the airplane on the basis of a single input from a single sensor.
Wow.
Yeah, and however bad you think that idea is, it's actually twice as bad.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
It is indeed.
And they purposefully didn't highlight this fact to people because they were trying to pass it off as it'll fly just like your old 737. They sold it to the airlines with the idea that you won't have to send people back to the simulator to learn how to fly this airplane. It'll fly just like the old one. They're already trained for it. And so even though it had a bunch of like the system isn't on the old 737s, you might want to know about that system. And they just sort of said, yeah, we're not going to tell anybody.
God. Well, and the 737 is one of those planes that, I remember flying on 737s in the 70s when they had those big long engines on them. And, here we are 40 years later, we're still flying on 737s, but it's a totally different plane. It just kind of looks the same.
And
totally different plane.
37 has a bunch of great stuff going for it. One of the problems they've run into, it's both its great strength and its great weakness, right? It's a very low-sitting airplane. And that was one of the things that they liked about it early on, is because they didn't have to like rebuild their airports to add 737 capability to it, because it was a low-sitting airplane. It sat low like the airplanes it was replacing. And so the problem is that you've got all these places that are optimized for 737s, but they're trying to do things like put bigger engines on it. And that was really what they did with the MAX. They needed bigger engines because they were trying to increase the range and increase the size of the airplane. So they had to push the engines forward of the wings. If you look at it, those engines don't hang directly underneath the wings. They are thrusted forward. Okay, so now you've changed the center of gravity. And so now you've got to put in software, because you've sold it to the airlines on they're not going to need to be any retraining.
Oh, jeez.
Now you've put in software to make it to compensate for that fact, and then they start running, and that's when it starts going off the rails. But the Navy adopted the 737 as its replacement for the P3, the P8, or
really,
Poseidon.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the P8 Poseidon is a funky 737 variant. It's like the fuselage of a 737-600 and the wings of an 800 or something like that. So it's got bigger wings than the size of fuselage. I'm not sure about the numbers, but it was something like that. And then, of course, they added all this combat capability onto it. And part of the deal was, the P3 was a unique aircraft, right? Nobody else was flying that. That was a converted airliner that was only in service as an airliner for a very short period of time. And the only people in the world that were flying the P3 were the U.S. Navy and some of our allies. But the thing, everybody flies 737s. And one of the big advantages of the P8, you can deploy to some field overseas and something breaks, and you just sort of walk over to an airline and say, I'd like to buy an Umpty Frats, and I got a government credit card.
Right.
And so that was one of the big things, is that they're plugging into this huge supply chain.
Yeah, that makes sense, huh?
And plus it's a smoother ride and easier maintenance capability. I mean, those old turboprops, the newer airplanes are just a lot more reliable, aside from the fact that they haven't been rode hard and put away wet for 30 years. So, yep. So I've never been on one. I was on a couple of P3s, never got a tactical flight. But I've seen these in Hawaii, mostly from a distance. I'd love a chance to go on board and see how they're kitted out on the inside, and just get a chance to see what they can do.
And then, right, the P3, the P3 was in service for a long time.
Yeah, it was in service forever. Well, lots of upgrades over the time period. But they were sort of slowly falling apart as those things happen towards the end of their lifespans. The new airplane is everything I've heard indicates that it's really good now. It sort of does its mission in a different kind of way than the P3 did, but that's as much to do with the fact that things evolve over time. A lot of people lament the fact, a lot of people in the military lament the fact that we threw away a lot of ASW capability, anti-submarine warfare capability, when the war ended, or Cold War ended, right? That we let a lot of that stuff die on the vine. I'm a lot more sanguine about that than a lot of other people are. And that's because the threat changed too. So we had a capability that was optimized for blue water operations against noisy nuclear submarines. And the threat became much more of an inshore threat against a lot quieter submarines. And it would have been nice if we could have maintained the training, especially in the air fleet, Because while we had these P3s, we weren't really using them for submarine stuff. We were using them more for surface search, or in the case of Afghanistan, we sent them overland because they got a really good radar. And so we had these Navy assets designed to hunt submarines that were hundreds of miles inland looking for bad guys in Jeeps and Toyota pickups and stuff like that. You know, it would have been nice if we could have tried to maintain some of that chain of knowledge. But the dirty little secret is, if you're not actually going out and being a practitioner in that stuff, you're going to lose it anyway. And they had other missions to do, and they needed training in those other missions. And so sometimes you just kind of got to say, you know, it's going to be really hard to regain this capability, but the right answer in this case is probably to let the capability go and then reestablish it later. It'll actually be easier in the long run to do it that way. And usually that engenders a response of, yeah, but it's going to be really hard. And it's like, yeah, I know it's going to be really hard. And you know what's also going to be really hard? Maintaining that capability in a world where they don't have an actual threat to practice against.
Yeah. Well, I think so. For next week, we will I'd love to read the article. Maybe I'll share the article so everyone can take a look at it by Claude Berube about a single design starship, and then we can just chat about that next weekend. Pat, are you going to be available next Saturday? Pat is driving.
Yes, I'll be available next.
All right, good.
And at some point, we should also talk about shields and defensive stuff and structural integrity fields and stuff like that too. So we haven't forgotten that, everybody. The other thing is we should come up with a mechanism whereby people can submit us questions in advance, and we can try to go over them.
Yeah, maybe we'll. Probably the good idea would be to start a Facebook group, and everyone can just join the Facebook group and ask the questions there.
Yeah, that works. I'd be happy to do that. I had said last week I was going to try to go through and post answers, go through the chat, and I went to do that tonight or today for last week's show, and I realized it actually makes you listen to the show.
Yeah.
And I had already listened. I always listen to the show afterwards, but I'd already done that, and I did. It's like I don't have an hour to do that right now.
I know. All right, everyone. Well, we will be back next Saturday. Once again, it's 10 o'clock p.m. We'll have more than just Pat's hand on a steering wheel. We'll actually have Pat. But thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight once again. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I'm always enlightened by it. We'll come back next Saturday and talk about all sorts of things, space combat wise. We'll see what we have time, and we'll stay tuned. We'll post about we'll post a either a thread on the Axanar page, or we'll create a whole new group and we'll advertise it so you can ask questions and we can have Chris and Pat answer those questions next weekend. So, all right. Well, that's it for now. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lissa, our producer. We appreciate it. Everyone, live long and prosper. And please wear your masks out there and be safe. Love you guys. Take care.
See you.